Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Anna Catalano's journey from oil industry titans to a prolific board career is truly global. Playing a vital role in BP's rebranding early in her career was proof enough that Anna is a special talent in business, backed up by an unparalleled ability to build genuine, lasting business relationships. Today, we explore how Anna built a career that spans the globe, developed a unique personal narrative, and prepared her move into a board career decades before it even happened. Anna, welcome to Pivot Points.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Why don't you just spend sort of a couple of minutes just introducing yourself and helping people understand your amazing background?
Oh, my goodness. So where do I start? So I was born and raised in the U.S., and I'm the daughter of immigrants to the United States, actually. My parents came from China, and I grew up in the Midwest where there are not a lot of Asian people, which made it unique. But I grew up speaking Mandarin as well as English, which was, at first it was kind of a pain because I had to study Chinese and stuff. But in the long run, it was great for my career. So I was one of those few Americans who actually went away for college, went to the University of Illinois for school, which was out of state, which is unusual to be done back then. But I majored in business and met my husband there at the University of Illinois. And we got married shortly after we graduated. I was a year ahead of him. I'm slightly older than him, but I'm a year ahead of him in college. So he always teases me about marrying an older woman. But shortly after leaving college, I started working for an oil company called Amoco. Amoco was based in Chicago at the time, but I started working in their office in Kansas City, which is where I grew up. And I went into sales and operations. So my first job was a sales territory in the state of North Dakota in the United States, where I called on gas station distributors, operators, and sold lubricants, tires, batteries, and accessories. I'm old enough that when I started in my career, gas stations still had backroom bays where they worked on cars. If you might not be old enough, Dave, to remember that, but I am. And so we sold them all the things that went into their stations. And, there were very few women, the oil business at the time, especially in sales. And so it was a real interesting beginning of a journey for me, being one of the few women in the industry. Being in North Dakota was actually nice because the folks there were wonderfully open. But to be honest, they had never really been around a lot of diversity. And so I think there were quite a few people there that thought I might have come off of one of the local Indian reservations because I looked so different. But it was wonderful. It was, I learned very quickly that what you needed to do was to get along with people. And if you got along with people, it helped a lot because then people wanted to work with you and help you. There were a lot of things that I went through early in my career that today would be considered very inappropriate comments, inappropriate, conversations. And so I learned very early on how to pick battles, because if you're someone who is known to complain about everything, no one's going to want to be around you. So I've always been a believer in understanding intent. And I don't think a lot of things that were said at that time were said with ill intent. Obviously getting accustomed to a young woman. I was 22 when I started in the company. Getting accustomed to working with a young woman when these guys were in their 40s and 50s wasn't as much an adjustment for them as it was for me. Yeah. So I think that they probably learned as much as I did along the way. And I'm still very good friends with many of my former colleagues that I started with the company back then. And they're wonderful people. And so that was a great experience. Not to say I didn't run into some jerks along the way. I certainly did. I could probably write a book, but I don't know if it would be a bestseller because I don't think I went through anything unusual versus, other women at the time. But it certainly gave me a lot of fortitude. It taught me how to be confident about myself. And, it gave me, I think, a lot of life skills that I think came in handy.
And is that where you got your sort of positive outlook? Because, I mean, you're one of the most upbeat people I've ever met. You're always so positive. Is that it? Did that come from that, or did that come from your parents? Or
I'd like to say I am an optimist. I'm an eternal optimist, sometimes to a fault. I think a lot of it came from my parents, Dave. They were immigrants that came to this country in 1949 for my dad, in 1953 for my mom, and they saw a part of history back in China that was probably some of the worst parts, pre-World War II, before the U.S. got involved in World War II, when Japan was in China. I mean, they saw atrocities and they had to deal with a lot of difficulties. So I think some of my inherent optimism comes from them. But I have been blessed in my life with wonderful people. So that helps keep that optimism going, I think.
And did you stay in sales at Amoco, or did you?
So I was in sales, and then Amoco did a wonderful thing by moving people from sales into marketing and back. So my first marketing assignment was pulling together programs for our nationwide distributor network, programs to promote the brand, to sell more gasoline and to sell more products. And so we had a habit of moving people from sales into marketing so that people would have empathy for, you develop the programs and then you have to go out and sell them. So it's nice to have people who have done both. And so that was my career early on. And then an interesting thing happened. When I started with the company shortly after I began, I made it very clear and I made it known to people during career conversations that if the company ever wanted to do anything in China, that I would be very interested in being a part of that because I grew up speaking Mandarin. I understood the culture, and it was a part of me that I would love to have had the opportunity to get in touch with. And so Joel and I were married shortly after we graduated college, and we waited almost 10 years to have our first child. We had her in 1992. And then in late 1994, when I was expecting my second child, the company decided to open an office in China for what was at that it's called the downstream, the refining and marketing part of the company. The company had already been in China in the upstream and in chemicals, but the downstream business had only been domestic. And so there was the interesting story where a meeting took place that I was not at, and there were a bunch of people in the room discussing who should we send to open this office in China. And I should say the room was all men. And somebody in the room said, we should send Anna. She's always wanted to go, and she speaks Mandarin. And then someone else said, yeah, but she's expecting a baby. She wouldn't want to go. So we need to think of someone else. So the conversation moved on, and then somebody in the room had the sense to stop the conversation and say, I think we should ask her.
Yeah.
We should ask her. And I thought that was an interesting moment in my career that I wasn't a part of. And I use that story when I talk to people about unconscious bias. The gentleman that initially said she wouldn't want to go was not someone who was out to ruin my career, I don't think. I have no idea, by the way, exactly who said these comments. I was told this third hand by someone who was in the room. But they were making an assumption about what I would want based on their beliefs and their biases. And so thank goodness they decided to ask me, because that was taking an overseas assignment was probably one of the most important decisions that happened in my career that really changed the trajectory of where I was headed. Until that time, I had been among a cohort of people that joined the company about the same time, and we were kind of tracking along with one another pretty steadily. When I took that international assignment, that really made a huge difference. So when they asked me, I said, I'll be happy to go as long as this child is born healthy, and I will know in about 3 months after the baby's born. At that time, we didn't know if it was boy or girl. There wasn't a lot of ultrasounds and things like that. But in Chinese tradition, there's a belief that after 100 days, if there's anything significantly wrong with the baby, you'll know. And so I told the company I'd go in 3 months. And sure enough, when he was 3 months old, our daughter was 2.5, and our son was 3 months. We took off on a plane and went to Beijing, and we were there for almost 2 years. So it was a great opportunity and really opened my eyes to a lot of things about business.
Amazingly exciting, and to do it with a young family, that must have been just fantastic for the experiences for the youngsters. And did China live up to expectations?
China exceeded expectations. It was amazingly exciting, and also, if I really thought about it longer, I might not have done it, because taking a newborn to a developing country, this was 1995, by the way. It was a different China than China today. There were still more people on bicycles than in cars, so you can imagine. But it was wonderful professionally, because I got to open up a representative office there, and we didn't have one. So I learned a lot about how you open up an office in a country that's a totalitarian country where more people can say no than yes, right? But from a personal standpoint, Dave, it was wonderful, because I got to meet relatives that I'd only ever heard of and had never met. So I got in touch with a part of myself that, it was missing, and it was fantastic. And if you were to talk to my husband, he would tell you that those 2 years were two of the most fantastic years of our lives together, because it was so different. He became conversationally fluent at the time we were in Beijing, because he decided he wanted to learn the language. And I had a driver. The company didn't let me drive. I had a driver and also a come-and-go nanny every day who only spoke Mandarin. So there was no choice but to learn. But it was a wonderful experience, both professionally and personally for us.
And what about the children? Did they both?
Well, our daughter remembers has faint memories of China. Our son, of course, was 2 when we came back, so he really didn't remember much. I'd like to think, there's been a lot of research that shows that you actually do remember everything. You just can't retrieve everything. So I'd like to think that starting them in a global perspective and a global life was a great thing for them, that later on became even greater when we moved to London for 5 years. So coming after returning to the US, I ran Amoco's retail business for quite some time, and then that's wrong. When we came back, I ran our international downstream business for a while, and then shortly after that was put in charge of Amoco's retail business across 33 states in the U.S., all operations. So that was a wonderful experience. And then just when you think you've got it figured out and what you're going to be doing for the next 20 years of your life throws a wrench. And it was announced that Amoco and BP were going to merge.
Yeah, I remember that.
In 1998. So that was a huge moment. My husband and I thought we were going to spend the rest of our adult lives in Chicago. And we ended up moving to London.
And what did it feel like being on the inside track of a big merger like that?
Being on the inside track of a merger is an interesting experience because, obviously there were a group of people who were in the know. I had been working on a small committee of people taking a look at M&A opportunities for Amoco. We had looked at a lot of different companies, but that kind of came and went, and it kind of went away. And so the committee kind of disbanded. Little did I know there was still a part of the committee that was together working on this thing. But, when the merger was announced, I wasn't totally surprised that it happened. I was a little surprised about the company, but you immediately think about what's going to happen to not only myself, but to the organization and the company and everything that we've been building for the last however many years, 15 years. Amoco was an interesting company in that it was an older company from a senior management standpoint than BP was. And so at the time of the merger, many of my colleagues chose to retire, chose to take the package and leave. I was very lucky that I had opportunities early in my career, and I was a young executive. And so part of what I was charged with and part of what kept me there, to be honest with you, was to help figure out where everyone could go. the next level of executives. BP was very interested in integrating the two companies from a leadership standpoint. And so I got put into a position where, I was asked, so who should we send on international postings? Who are the top marketing and sales people, downstream people who we want to make sure they get an opportunity. So I was in a unique position to be able to input into the names of people who ended up getting some wonderful opportunities with the new organization. So shortly after the merger, I was shipped off to London, where I became Group Vice President of Emerging Markets at the time. I describe that as all of the places in the world where you can't drink water out of the tap. That's how I used to describe my job. But it was all the developing markets for the downstream part of the business. And during that period of time, I got to spend some time chatting with our CEO, who, and BP was a very flat organization. And our CEO at the time, John Brown, spent a lot of time with the group vice presidents chatting with us. And we got onto the topic of marketing once, and he wanted to pick my brain. John was on the board of Intel at the time, so he was very familiar with the power of a brand. And we got to spend a lot of time talking about it. And he said, we've never really had a global head of marketing. I would like for you to do that. So I was named Group Vice President of Marketing, and we knew that what we needed to do at the time was rebrand the company. And so I was a big part, I'd like to think, of the new BP brand. If you recall, the old brand was a shield with the letters BP on it. And Amoco was the torch and oval with the word Amoco. And we decided that these two companies needed to come together under a single brand, both internally and externally. And Dave, I think that's when you and I met. When we decided to do that, I knew that it was a big job. And I was introduced at that time to Shelley Lazarus at Ogilvy, if you recall. And she introduced me to the CMO at IBM, who had just gone through this at IBM. And so I learned from Abby Constam. And we embarked on this huge rebranding of the company, not only a new logo, but a set of brand values that we adopted across the company. And it was probably, the highlight of my professional career in chapter 1, I call it, because I'm now in chapter 2. But it was a great learning experience.
No, not many CMOs get to do a sort of a brand creation at that level.
Yeah.
They don't come along like buses.
No, they don't. And I recognized when we were going through it, it was a very, very unique opportunity. And I was very lucky to be at the right place at the right time to take part in that.
Yeah. And I mean, the great thing about that sort of piece of work was both Amoco and BP cut their ties to the past a little bit, and new BP was amazing. It probably could do with an update again now, because it's 25 years old or something.
Yeah, it is 25 years old, and they've strategically gone through quite a bit. But I remember specifically one of the things that we said was we were a company that shared no common past, but we shared a common future, which is why we needed to rebrand. And it was a real rallying point for the company internally, and of course caught a lot of attention externally. I mean, Beyond Petroleum was our tagline, and there were quite a few people that took issue to that, both internally and externally. Interestingly, I think we were ahead of our time in terms of understanding that the industry was one that needed to really define how it was going to proceed. Otherwise, there was an issue of license to operate that we would be suffering from. And so, if I could do it all again, I'd do it all again, Dave. I would do the same thing again. I do believe that it is one of the most important industries in the world, if not the most important, that has a tremendous responsibility to how it operates in order to continue to operate.
And how did you find sort of, again, moving family from Chicago to London? Was that an enjoyable experience, a learning experience? Because you're now building some international family capabilities here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we moved to London, the family was in a different situation than it was when we moved to China. By that time, my husband had actually decided to quit and stay home, and he was a stay-at-home dad. When our kids were 6 and 3 after China, while we were in Chicago, he made the decision. He said, "Look," he said, the kids are at a really important age, and I'll stay home. You've got more opportunity with Amico at the time. He said, I'll stay home and take care of the kids. So when we moved to London, I was the sole breadwinner, and he was what was called the trailing spouse, but vitally important to how quickly the family adjusted. And our kids, of course, were old enough to know what was going on.
Yeah.
And they went to school at the American school in London. And we lived just off of Marylebone Road and Baker Street. We ended up buying a flat and renovating it, and it was fabulous. We loved it. And so those years that we spent in London were very, very special. In fact, my son currently is at Oxford getting an MBA. And when the opportunity came, he said, oh, goodness, I've got an opportunity to go back to England. Absolutely, we're going to do it. So he's there with his wife and 2 kids in tow. And, it's one of those things that I know, having grown up in a global family, he didn't think twice about it. In fact, probably saw a real benefit in it.
And what made you then decide to sort of leave BP? And
so when everything is going so well, what makes you decide? What makes you decide to go? So I was in London for 5 years, and we were doing, we were really enjoying our time there. But the company was obviously going to be going through a transition. I knew that John was going to be retiring, in the next few years. And as I looked at my career and I saw potential leadership replacing him, I realized I needed to make a decision. I was 43 years old, and my parents were experiencing some health issues back in the States. My father had suffered a stroke in 2001 at the end of the year, and he was in a wheelchair. And my mom was having a difficult time with it. So, we had spent 7 of the last 10 years at that time living overseas. It becomes clear that if you want to spend time with family, you don't have all the time in the world to do that. And I realized I had just gone through probably one of the most, envied positions as a head of marketing for a company that just rebranded, one of the largest firms in the world. And I knew it wasn't probably going to be better than that at BP. I was realistic in knowing that if I had stayed, I probably would have been in the same job or a comparable job for the next 15 years of my career, being that I was 43. It was clear to me the culture of BP was very different than what I grew up with at Amico. I was not a man. I was not British. I was not an engineer. I didn't grow up on the upstream side of the business, which is where the majority of leadership comes from. And so I was pretty realistic in thinking, if I stay here, I'll be doing this for the next 15. I don't know if I want to do that. So I made the decision to quit. I actually didn't have anything else lined up, but I knew that we needed to come back to the States. We knew that it was a time to make that change and to come back to the States. So I tendered my resignation to John. Difficult conversation, but I think over time he understood. And so we came back to the States. And while we lived in London, we had a home in Florida that we maintained for winters and summers and all that. My husband and the kids would come back to our Florida home while I stayed in London in the summer. And so we decided just to move there because we had a place there while I figured out what I wanted to do. And I went through a number of interviews, CMO positions in large corporations. And, Dave, as I chatted with these companies, I realized it felt like I was going to get the same T-shirt in a different color. I just rebranded a company. It wasn't going to get much bigger than that. And as I was figuring out what I wanted to do, we decided to move to Houston, where it was a bigger city. Our home was in Vero Beach, Florida. It was super small town, wonderful town, but very small. And our kids, had gone from an international environment in London to, a place where my daughter came home and said, I'm the only kid on the volleyball team with dark hair. So we decided to move to Houston, where I have a sister who lives here. And at the time, my parents were living here. And so I said, hey, let's just move. It's a great airport. It's easy for travel. I had already started doing some board work, so I was familiar with that, part of the business world. And shortly after moving to Houston, where we bought a home, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and cancer in the same month. And, talk about unexpected things, again, that life throws at you. It was a very easy decision for me at that time to pivot into a full-time board career. We built an addition onto our home, moved my parents in with us. We moved my husband's mother, who was living by herself, down to Houston. And for the next 10 years, we saw our parents through their final chapters of their lives, which was an incredible privilege to have the opportunity to do that. And I went into a full-time board career at the age of 43. The advantage of a board career is that you know your schedule ahead of time. You have tremendous flexibility in terms of moving other things in your life around. Of course, you can't move board meetings, but you can move other things around. And it also gave me time to not only spend with my parents, but to spend with my children when they went to middle school and high school before they went off to college. So it was a blessing to have that opportunity. I know that when you leave a full-time executive career, you don't maximize the amount of money that you can make. But at the end of the day, Joel and I got married when we were 23. We had more than we ever dreamed that we would have at that time. And, we had enough. You always have as much as you need, and you never have as much as you want, is what my mother always said. So it was an easy decision for me, and it was wonderful. I'm really glad I made that decision.
Yeah. And I mean, what advice would you give other people who are sort of thinking about pivoting out of a corporate career into a board career? Because most people seem to do that in their late 50s, early 60s, start transitioning out of corporate life into a portfolio of non-execs. You did it incredibly early.
Yeah, I pivoted into a board career tremendously early because I was very lucky. I had essentially a C-suite position when I was 43 years old.
Yeah.
I think that for people thinking about pivoting, I think there's a few things you need. I think you definitely need a high-level executive role if you want to pivot into public board independent director career. I think the other things you need is you need to be connected with people who put names forward for these roles. And that's not just people who are headhunters who have your resume, but people who really know you. So I'll go back and I'll tell a story, Dave. When I was in my late 20s, I got a phone call one day from a recruiter, a headhunter with Heidrick & Struggles. And he said, hey, you don't know me, but I came across your info. I'm doing a search for a division manager or some junior executive position at a company called Praxair. Are you interested in moving and changing? And I said, my career right now at Amoco is going very well. So I think I'm okay, but I appreciate the call. But next time you're in Chicago, give me a shout and let's grab a coffee. And so I said, okay. And sure enough, a few months later, this guy called me up again. He said, hey, I called you a few months ago. I'm in town. Was wondering if you want to grab a coffee. And I said, sure. So we did, and we totally hit it off. And from that day on, for the next 20 years, in every city I lived in around the world, wherever Andy Talkington traveled to, he would look me up, call me up, we'd grab lunch, we'd grab coffee, and we got to know each other. I got to know his wife. He got to know my husband. We ended up getting to, know when we had kids. I mean, we were both young people when we started. Mm. And at the time I left, when I made the decision to leave BP, he had moved up at Heidrick & Struggles and was doing board search. And he was the first person I called when I told him I was going to pivot into this board career. And Andy got me onto my first U.S. board. Mm. So I tell that story. I love telling that story to young people at university because I say, if the first time you call a recruiter is when you want to get on a board, good luck with that. because they get 500 resumes a week
Yeah.
from people who want to get onto a board. But it really helps to know people who actually know you, who know what you've done, who know what you're good at doing, who know what you don't enjoy doing. When they are in a position to put your name forward, that carries a lot of weight. So being networked and connected to people who can put your name forward, I think is super important. I think the other thing that's really important is to have a good story about what makes you really unique that other people don't have. Because unless you are a former CEO or CFO or sitting CEO, CFO, it's super competitive out there.
Mm.
The model used to be boards were all made up of former CEOs. In fact, they used to all sit on each other's boards, right? There was a lot of overlap with these CEOs. But anymore, boards are realizing that they need different types of voices at the table.
Mm.
And so even former CEOs, I mean, if you're CEO of a large Fortune 50 company, you're not going to have trouble getting on a board. It's a matter of, do you want to do that?
Yeah.
But I think that it's tremendously competitive. And what you need to be able to do is talk about what is it about you that makes you tremendously unique that a board would want in their boardroom.
Mm.
And so I think you really have to work it. My advice for anyone who wants to get on a board these days and to pivot from an executive career onto a board career is to realize you really have to work hard to make that happen.
Yeah.
It does not come easily.
No, I mean, I love that story about the relationships and investing in relationships. And it's always a principle I've tried to embrace, where you look after people, you're nice to people, you're good to people.
Yeah.
You've just got no idea if 10 years later, 15 years later, that person can effect a pivot in your life you could have never imagined when you have a cup of coffee in Chicago.
That's exactly right. And that's, the business world, as in all parts of the world, is built on relationships, isn't it?
Totally.
And I think it's really easy to lose sight of that these days, especially with how easy technology makes it to kind of, quote unquote, be in touch with people.
Yeah. No, and I see so many people who they have a great relationship. Let's say you're CMO BP, you've got a big budget, everybody loves you. Suddenly you decide to stop being CMO of BP and 3 people stay with you. And that to me is just crazy. But
it is.
Those people who only are nice to you because you can spend money with them and then they evaporate, they're not real people in my mind.
Oh, exactly. I hear from a lot of people over the years. I've heard from a lot of people who thought of me when they left BP, but in the 15 years after I left, they never looked me. I mean, people know I went through a tough time. Making a big decision like that is a tough decision to make. And you remember people who stick with you and ask you, how are you doing, right? Mm. And the number of people who called me up after they left and said, can you get me on a board? So many dozen. But, I didn't know them anymore. Mm. I really didn't. I didn't know their story anymore. And so there were a few I was able to help, but, quite a few that I couldn't because I just didn't know them.
No, exactly right. And, if only people show up in your life when they want something, then that's not good.
It's not very genuine.
No, exactly. And so what's it been like building a board career? I'm fascinated to know, because you're doing lots of different things, but now you have authority, but the buck doesn't stop with you on anything. That must be quite nice, isn't it?
Well, the adjustment and the transition to a board career is really different. And probably the most difficult thing was when you go from an executive role into a board role, you go from being the one that makes the decisions to being one who affects decisions, right? Yeah. And so it has been a change for me, but it actually has been wonderful. So one thing that I was able to do in this chapter of my career, and I'm a real believer in multiple chapters in a person's career, and this definitely feels like a separate chapter. I told the recruiters that I didn't want to be only on oil and gas boards. I said, I have spent, 20 years of a career being with companies that didn't know how to spell marketing. Because oil and gas is not about marketing. It's about finding things in the earth, bringing them up, and doing things with them. It's an engineering world, right? It's a geology and engineering world. And so I said, please help me grow a portfolio across a number of industries. And so I was able to do that. That's been the best part of this chapter for me is I have served on boards of consumer products, consumer services, insurance, chemicals, and now on oil and gas. I joined my first oil and gas board 7 years ago. So it has been a wonderful learning experience for me. I've learned more about business in this chapter of my life than I did previously because I have been exposed to so many different business models and so many different things to consider. I've learned about mergers and acquisitions. I've learned about activists. I've learned about, companies coming out of bankruptcy. I've learned a lot that has taught me a lot about the business world, which has been an incredible gift.
And do you ever think about going back into like CEO role now you've learned all of it?
I was asked early on when I started this whether it's something that I'd be interested in. And of course, at the time, it was during those 10 years I was taking care of my parents. And I said no. And I think I'm past it. I haven't been asked in the last 5 years, which is fine with me. Could I still do it? Yeah, maybe I could. And, if something interesting came along now, I might think about it. But this has been a wonderful way to continue to make impact, to continue to learn, and to be able to leverage the experience I have across a number of different types of companies. And I've had the privilege of working with some amazing CEOs and executives, just amazing. And I've also learned a lot about what boards should do. Interestingly, when I was at BP, it was an old-time board, and all I ever did was go in and present. I presented the brand. I presented programs we did. I presented sponsorship thing. I presented ideas, but I presented and I'd leave. I was never invited to stick around. And so I've had an opportunity and have learned what good boards really do and what kinds of conversations they have and invite. And the importance of having the right voices around the table and not having everyone there just to get through a meeting and have a lavish dinner somewhere or go golfing somewhere. I mean, I really enjoy a boardroom made up of people who are truly interested in rolling up their shirt sleeves and helping an executive team think through options. The business world's gotten so complex. You know that. You've seen that happen. There's so many things to consider these days, and change is happening so quickly that you got to have the right people in a conversation.
And do you think about teaching or, helping other sort of people in their career, earlier in their career, thinking, because this is a great option to live your life in a different way, and it could add such diversity to boardrooms if people were doing this in their 40s like you did, as opposed to end of career or perceived end of career.
Yeah, so I've spoken from time to time at business schools around the U.S., which has been great. I had a friend who was a professor at Notre Dame, and I was speaking to his executive MBA class every year. I talk about board governance, a lot of what we've talked about, how to get on boards and what boards do and things like that. I've also gotten very involved with a group here in the U.S. Called the National Association of Corporate Directors. It's the largest organization focused on board governance in the United States. I served as the chapter chair here for a couple of years, served on part of the national board that oversaw director certification. So I've been involved in helping shape the conversation around board governance in the States. The idea of teaching has occurred to me. I've never been offered. I have been invited to speak at a number of places, but have never been offered. I don't know if full-time teaching is something that I would want to do at this stage of my life. I mean, my board schedule is pretty packed right now, so I think I would have a hard time committing to anything like that.
How many boards are you on at the moment? So
I'm currently on 3 public and 1 private.
Okay,
but for most of the time I've been doing this, I've been on 4 public boards. So it's been pretty full time.
That is pretty full time.
Yeah.
What's your sort of biggest learning, would you say, from doing the portfolio as opposed to the corporate? Is it freedom or?
Freedom has been great. I've really enjoyed the diversity of industries that I've been able to take part in. These, conversations in a consumer products company. I was on the board of an infant nutrition company that made infant formula before we sold to Reckitt a few years ago. And, that conversation versus the conversation around risk at an insurance company versus conversations in a manufacturing company that manufactures specialty chemicals is very different. And I've really, really enjoyed that part of this chapter. Speaking to different types of individuals, the makeup of these boards is very different. The conversations are different. A lot of the issues they deal with are similar at the board level. Obviously, the business models are very different. If it's B2B versus a B2C business, it is different. But great leadership is great leadership, right? I mean, where I've seen great CEOs, it has less to do with the industry. It has more to do with the person.
Yeah, and I always remember John Brown saying to me when I was getting carried away on brand, Dave, the business of business is business.
He always had really good quips like that. He was right.
Yeah. Don't get too carried away.
It's very true.
That's a fantastic way to end. Great leadership is always great leadership. Now, we always end these podcasts with a little fun fact. And, I was very surprised to hear your sort of opera. And you're going to have to tell us a little bit about, you really did think about doing opera?
So I did. So my parents both had amazing singing voices, and I was lucky to inherit just a little bit of that. And I sang all through high school, started taking voice lessons when I was in middle school. And then I also continued on in college. But my mother did a very bright thing for me when I was a senior in high school. When I told her I was thinking about studying voice, she was a typical Asian tiger mom, but not typical in terms of how she delivered messages. So she bought me a ticket to the regional Metropolitan Opera auditions in Kansas City, my hometown. And I got to go and listen to the most amazing afternoon of voices I think I've ever heard. And at the end of that competition, Dave, one person moved on.
Yeah, of course.
And everyone else, I don't know what they did. I didn't keep the names, but I thought to myself, wow, okay, that's a real tough business. And actually, I don't think I'm good enough. So I continued to take voice for a couple of years in college. And then my business classes got busy, so I just dropped it. And so other than singing at my sister's weddings and friends' weddings, and nowadays only singing in the shower if nobody else is in the home, I really don't do much. But yeah, that was something I seriously thought about doing. I had the lead in my school musical in high school, and I kind of caught the bug for the stage thing, and I loved it. And so I thought, oh, this would be so much fun. And boy, am I glad I didn't do that, because I would not have made it. And, you and I wouldn't be talking today, and I wouldn't have had the kind of career that I did. Interestingly, my son actually dabbled in it, went into opera, and actually did quite well. And COVID stopped him. Wow. 2020, he had some paid contracts that year, and COVID shut it down. So he pivoted into a business career and is now working at McKinsey.
Yeah.
So,
that doesn't surprise me.
Hey, but at least he tried it. I didn't give it a go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
never
glad
too late.
I didn't.
It's never too late.
Oh, no. It's certainly too late. Certainly too late.
Well, it's been absolutely fabulous talking to you, and I can't believe how the time has flown. That was just awesome. Awesome.
It has.
So thank you very much for coming on Pivot Points. It's been a delight, and the energy you bring to everything is just astounding. Always astounded me. So, wish you every best, Anna, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it, and we'll see each other again soon.
Okay, bye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pi and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpi.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.